Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the primary election set to be held today, May 24th, in the states of Arkansas, Alabama, and Georgia. As a side note, there's also going to be primaries in Minnesota's 1st congressional district to fill a vacancy of a Republican senator who passed away a few months ago that formerly occupied that district. So first, we'll take a look at the state of Arkansas, but before we do, please consider subscribing down below if you're new and liking this video. If you want to see more elections predictions and political analysis, I upload 4 to 5 times a week, and it really helps out the channel. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So first, looking at the state of Arkansas, there's really not a whole lot to talk about. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is running unopposed for the Republican nomination for governor in the state. She's basically been endorsed by just about any Republican you can think of, President Trump, Republican politicians, pundits, etc. She's basically unopposed, and based on the state of Arkansas's political leanings, a heavily Republican state, it's likely to stay in Republican hands. And in 2018, during a blue wave year, Asa Hutchinson, who's more of a moderate Republican for a state like Arkansas, won by a total landslide, even for Arkansas standards, blowing out his Democratic opponent with a 34% margin of victory thereabouts. So that's really it for the state of Arkansas. There's not a whole lot else to talk about here. Alabama and Georgia have the more competitive primaries. If we take a look at the state of Alabama now, there's 2 main races I want to talk about. The Senate race in particular is most likely going to be the most competitive here, and that is between the 3 Republicans basically vying for this spot to be the nominee for Senate here. We have Katie Britt, Mo Brooks, and Mike Durant. Now, originally, early on in this primary, Mo Brooks got the Trump endorsement, and as a result, he had a comfortable lead in the polls. But this also led to complacency on the part of him and his campaign. He wasn't really campaigning, wasn't really doing events, etc. And as a result, he started to slip in the polls pretty dramatically to the point where Donald Trump withdrew his endorsement from him, as with other Trump officials like Stephen Miller, Michael Flynn, and other people associated with the former Trump administration. Now, the leader in the polls right now is Katie Britt. Mo Brooks is in 2nd place, and Mike Durant is in 3rd. In Alabama, like other Deep South states, you have a runoff system in which if no candidate gets 50% of the vote in the primary or general election, there is a runoff election which just takes the top 2 candidates, and then they go head-to-head with each other. And so far, it looks like Mo Brooks might be securing his spot for 2nd place. I think it's very likely that Mo Brooks comes in 2nd. However, I'm not too confident in his ability to win a runoff election. Trump did withdraw his endorsement, but not only that, he went on Truth Social, his social media platform, and denounced Mo Brooks for using the previous Trump endorsement on leaflets and letters he was sending out to constituents all across the state. So he had this letter basically saying that he was Trump endorsed, Mo Brooks would make a great senator, yada, yada, yada. And Donald Trump basically came out and refuted that, saying he doesn't have the endorsement and he's not supposed to be using the Trump endorsement that is no longer valid. So this just proves that Donald Trump is not going to re-endorse Mo Brooks. There was some speculation among some in the Republican circles that Donald Trump was going to re-endorse Mo Brooks either during the runoff election or before that, but it never ended up happening. He has yet to endorse anyone in this primary. Katie Britt has a lot of endorsements. I guess she's more of the establishment candidate. She has the endorsements of the likes of Lindsey Graham, Richard Shelby, Joni Ernst. So she's definitely the more moderate Republican in the race. Mo Brooks and Mike Durant really are head-to-head at the moment in a battle for 2nd place. But ultimately, if Mo Brooks is able to get in 2nd place, he will make it to the runoff. But like I said, if Trump decides to endorse Katie Britt, then it's almost impossible, I think, for Mo Brooks to win in the runoff election. But Mo Brooks certainly is probably the Republican in this race that most aligns with President Trump's political policies. So it remains to be seen how this primary is likely to turn out. But if I had to take a guess, I think Mo Brooks comes in 2nd and Katie Britt comes in 1st. Mike Durant and the other candidates are eliminated in this race. Also, there is a lesser known race for governor, at least the primary that is, and that election is not really as covered much because it's not really seen as that competitive. If we take a look at some of the polls here for the Republican governor's primary in Alabama, Kay Ivey has a solid lead. She also has multiple people opposing her. However, in most polls, at least the recent polls, she's not polling above 50%. She has 50% in the aggregate, but the latest polls, she is polling under 50%. And that's good news for her prime opponent, Linda Blanchard, because they will probably end up going off to a runoff. Now, it's unlikely that an incumbent Republican governor would be primaried out. Primarying out any incumbent governor is extremely rare in American politics. And as we saw with the primaries in Ohio, in Texas, a lot of these primary challengers really went nowhere. And ultimately, I think that Kay Ivey is going to win her nomination for governor, and she's ultimately going to win the governor's election once again. So that takes us now to the most competitive state out of these two, at least in the general election, the state of Georgia. There's a couple of high-profile primaries happening in the state, mainly that for governor and Secretary of State are the ones that are getting the most attention. So if we take a look at the governor's race, David Perdue, the former Republican senator, is challenging incumbent Republican Governor Brian Kemp in the primary. We covered this race a couple of times on this channel, and ultimately my prediction still stands. I think Brian Kemp has a solid enough lead in the polls to avoid a runoff election and ultimately will defeat David Perdue in the runoff and then go on to the general election. The latest poll, which is from May 22nd, just 2 days ago, has this at a 60-30 race. Now, I think at the end of the day, David Perdue will probably do better than his polling says he will, but I think Brian Kemp will also increase on his polling. So we could see a situation where Brian Kemp gets like 58% of the vote, David Perdue maybe gets 38 or something like that, and the rest goes to the remaining candidates. Really remains to be seen, but I think Brian Kemp is in a strong position in the primary. And he always was. I mean, even going back to when Donald Trump was criticizing him for his perceived lack of loyalty after the 2020 election, even though Brian Kemp didn't really have the power to do the things that Trump thought he could do. Ultimately, it started bad blood between the two of them. But even despite that, Brian Kemp was always ahead in the primary polls, with rare exceptions. And ultimately, that's why I think Brian Kemp is an incredibly strong candidate. Despite publicly feuding with Trump, although it's usually Trump doing most of the feuding against Brian Kemp, but despite the two of them being at odds, Brian Kemp is still able to solidify a larger chunk of the Republican base than Trump is around Perdue. And I think part of that also has to do with the fact that Perdue is really running a lackluster campaign. He's mostly only focusing on the previous election and his Trump endorsement, and that's about it. Also fresh in the minds of a lot of Republican voters is the fact that David Perdue lost to Jon Ossoff by about 1.5 points just a year ago. Brian Kemp did not lose statewide in the state of Georgia. In fact, during a blue wave year, he won the governor's mansion with 1.4% of a margin. This was a year, by the way, where you saw states like Kansas going blue and, a number of other statewide races throughout the country going blue. But Georgia stayed red. Even though Georgia was a state that only voted for Donald Trump by 5 points, it managed to stay red. And I think that's a testament to Brian Kemp's strength as a candidate. So ultimately, Brian Kemp is in a good position, not only in the primary, but also in the general election. Now, moving on to the Secretary of State election, this is an even more interesting primary because you have Brad Raffensperger, who is loathed by a large wing of the Republican Party, and his main opponent, Jody Hice. Now, if we take a look at the polling for this primary, it's somewhat, the latest poll is neck and neck, and there's a couple polls that have it close. I think this is certainly going to go to a runoff, and Brad Raffensperger may be defeated in this primary when we get to the runoff. Of course, we'll make a separate video covering that when it happens, but I think Raffensperger is in a unique position because he was more publicly announcing Trump on media when, that phone call was released about the 11,000 ballots and stuff. And a lot of Republican voters haven't forgot that. And ultimately, I think that's why Raffensperger is in a much poorer position than somebody like Brian Kemp, who has still said he supports the former president's agenda. He, through policy, instituted a lot of strongly conservative policies in the state of Georgia. So I think Raffensperger just doesn't have the same record that somebody like Kemp does. Raffensperger also, during COVID, gave out mail-in ballots to every registered voter in the entire state. And some people criticize him for doing that, as it may have led to Georgia actually becoming a Democratic state in 2020 because you had very, very high voter turnout. So ultimately, I think that's one of the big reasons. Of course, Raffensperger was a big proponent of mail-in ballot as Secretary of State. And, that is something that most Republican voters vehemently oppose in most instances. And that's why I think this primary is a lot more competitive than the other primaries in the state of Georgia. So ultimately, I do think that the Secretary of State primary will go to a runoff. I think Raffensperger has a chance to finish first, but I think ultimately, when a runoff election does happen, he could potentially be defeated. And I think this is probably the most interesting primary of the entire night. I don't really think Purdue has a realistic chance. The Alabama primary will be interesting too, because that's almost certainly going to a runoff. So those are really the two main primaries I would watch on election night when it comes to these deep southern states. And we still have a lot of primaries left to go. June is going to be a big month for primaries. We'll try to cover as many of them as we can. I won't be able to live stream during tonight's primary or the primary during June. I'll be away both of those days. But for the rest of the primaries, I'll try to do live streams and predictions as they come. Anyway, guys, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.